After the shift I'd just pulled, all I wanted was a quiet night at home. I'd been out for 24 hours straight, bouncing between fires, crashes, and whatever other chaos a firefighter gets thrown into. It was all the same to me by the end of it. I was running on fumes, just craving a shower and maybe a beer before I crashed for good. But as I turned onto our street, something twisted in my gut. Some strange tension that pulled tight as I got closer to home. Celine's car was parked out front, but the house was dark. She always left a light on if I'd been out, just a habit she had since we got married. I dialed her number as I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, but it rang and rang, finally clicking to voicemail. That was the third time I tried calling her today with no answer. Unusual, but I told myself she'd been busy, probably grading papers for her high school English classes or helping one of her students. She liked to be the dependable one, you know, the teacher they could count on. But as I walked up to the front door, my steps slowed. There was something faint, a low thumping I could barely make out until I stopped and listened. It was music, muffled but steady, coming from the basement. I tried to recall the last time we'd used the sound system down there. I hadn't even set foot in the basement for weeks, too busy to finish organizing the boxes down there. For all I knew, Celine had turned it into her own space while I was at work, but something still felt wrong about it. I pushed the door open slowly, and that strange sense of unease washed over me again, stronger this time. Dropping my bag in the entryway, I stepped into the house, noting every detail. Celine's shoes by the door, her favorite scarf tossed over the back of the couch. Everything seemed fine, but the sound of that music kept pulling me toward the basement door, like it had a grip on me. I didn't know what I'd find down there, but I knew I had to go. As I headed down the basement stairs, the air got colder, thicker somehow. With each step, that dread pooled in my stomach, and my heart beat faster. And then, just as I reached the bottom, I caught sight of them. There, in the dim light, Celine and my best friend, Orion Stone, were tangled together on the old couch. They were so wrapped up in each other they hadn't even heard me come in. Time seemed to freeze. There they were, Celine, my wife of 7 years, and Orion, the guy I'd known since high school, the guy who was like family to me. Seeing them together like that, right there in my house, felt like a punch to the gut that left me breathless. I must have made some kind of noise without realizing it, because suddenly they both looked up, their faces going pale as they noticed me standing there. Celine's eyes went wide, and for a second, she looked just as stunned as I felt, like she was caught off guard by her own betrayal. Orion, though, was different. His expression was more controlled, like he was just trying to keep his cool. He sat there, frozen, not saying a word, probably hoping I'd turn around and disappear like nothing had happened. But I couldn't move. My feet felt like they were bolted to the floor, my chest heavy, like someone had wrapped a band around it. I couldn't decide if I wanted to scream, to ask them both what the hell was going on, or if I should just walk away. My mind was racing, trying to process what I was seeing, but nothing made sense. All those late nights I'd spent at work, the excuses Celine gave when she said she was busy with school stuff, all those pieces started clicking into place in the worst possible way. And then, as if a switch flipped inside me, something took over. I didn't say a word. I just turned on my heel and walked back up the stairs, not even looking back. I heard Celine call after me, her voice shaky, pleading, but I kept moving, numb and cold, like I was on autopilot. Back in the kitchen, I grabbed a glass of water, holding it with both hands to stop them from shaking. My mind raced through every interaction I'd had with Orion over the last few months, the times he'd dropped by unexpectedly, the conversations he'd steered toward how tough it must be for Celine, alone so often with my schedule. The guy had sat at my table, eaten meals with us, laughed with me like he wasn't planning to tear my world apart. I set the glass down, the sound of it hitting the counter sharper than I expected. As I stood there, my mind settled into a strange, quiet focus. My shock was shifting, hardening into something else, something more dangerous. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the walls, feeling like a stranger in my own home. The silence had a weight to it, pressing down on me until I couldn't ignore it. My mind was racing, every thought snapping back to what I'd seen downstairs, Celine and Orion together right there, like I was some fool they could brush aside. I felt my jaw tighten, a dull ache settling in from how hard I was clenching my teeth. I'd always prided myself on being a calm guy, someone who could keep it together when things got tough. At the station, I was the one people could count on. But here right now in my own home, That calm was slipping, my chest tightening as questions flooded in. How long had they been sneaking around? Had there been signs I'd ignored? Or was it that I'd trusted them so completely I never thought to look for any? As I took a deep breath, my mind kept replaying the times Orion had shown up out of the blue, acting like nothing was wrong, laughing over beers, talking about life. He'd been in our home so often, talking about how tough my hours must be on Celine. Sometimes, he'd even go out of his way to ask if she was holding up okay. And I bought it, every damn word. My hand hovered over the photo of Celine and me on our wedding day, both of us grinning like we had everything figured out. Now, that photo felt like a slap in the face. How many times had I missed the truth staring back at me? I finally reached out, flipped the frame over, and set it face down. I couldn't look at that picture right now. The buzzing of my phone jolted me back, and I glanced down. It was a text from the firehouse, just a reminder about tomorrow's meeting. But something about seeing that message grounded me, reminded me that there was a place where things still made sense. The station was where people had each other's backs, where loyalty mattered. Here, I felt like a stranger, surrounded by shadows of the people I thought I knew. An idea crept into my mind. The security cameras. We'd installed them a while back for insurance purposes, and I'd never thought much about them since. Celine probably hadn't either. If those cameras had been recording, there was a chance they'd caught more than just their little basement tryst tonight. And if they'd been meeting here before, it'd all be on tape. I took a deep breath, pulled out my phone, and opened the Notes app. I started listing everything I'd need: security footage, old bank records, anything that could show their tracks. Every unexplained withdrawal, every suspicious school expense, I'd find it all. If they thought they were smart enough to hide this from me, they'd underestimated me. And I was going to make sure they'd regret that. My breathing slowed as I kept typing, a strange calm settling over me. I was used to pressure. I'd spent years charging into burning buildings, keeping my cool while chaos unfolded around me. Tonight was no different. I'd gather every bit of evidence I needed, and when the time was right, I'd lay it all out for them. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see them together. That image burned into my mind like a scar I couldn't shake. I lay there in the dark, thinking about every little detail I'd need to pull this off, letting the plan settle into place. When dawn crept through the blinds, I got up and headed straight for the basement. I opened the door and took a long look around, letting it all sink in. The room was full of the usual stuff: boxes we'd never unpacked, old furniture, and workout gear covered in dust. But now, it felt different, like a crime scene, every corner hiding traces of their betrayal. I scanned the room, trying to spot anything that seemed out of place, anything that could give me the upper hand. Then, I saw it. An empty wine glass on the coffee table, one of our good glasses, the ones we barely used. It was just sitting there, like they'd left it behind in a hurry. My stomach twisted as I reached down to pick it up, imagining them here, treating my home like their private hideaway. I took a closer look around and noticed a few other things that didn't belong. A blanket we normally kept upstairs was folded on the couch, and there were wrappers from some snack we never bought. Little signs that they'd made themselves comfortable, like this was their place and not mine. The anger simmered again, but I forced myself to stay calm. This was exactly the kind of proof I needed, the little pieces that would help build the case against them. I grabbed a couple of paper towels and carefully wrapped the glass and wrappers, setting them aside. It felt strange, gathering evidence like this, like I was some investigator in a case I never wanted to solve. But it was necessary. Every piece of proof brought me closer to the truth and further from the lies they'd been feeding me. Upstairs, I opened my laptop and started digging through the security camera footage. We hadn't looked at it in months, but the files were all there, saved and waiting. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. I clicked through the dates, scanning each video until I started seeing patterns. Orion's car parked out front at odd hours, Celine meeting him at the door, always checking over her shoulder. They were careful, but not careful enough. Watching them together was like being stabbed all over again. Each scene played out with a kind of silent cruelty, like they knew this was wrong but had convinced themselves I'd never know. But now I did. I paused the footage, took a deep breath, and saved each clip to a separate folder. When the time came, I'd be ready. I leaned back in my chair, letting the exhaustion wash over me, but this time it was different. It wasn't just the fatigue from a long night, it was the weight of betrayal, pressing down, settling deep. They'd stolen something from me: trust, respect, maybe even my sense of who I was. But if they thought they'd get away with it, they were dead wrong. The morning rolled in slowly, creeping through the blinds, casting long shadows over the room. The house was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. Normally, Celine would be up by now, fussing around with breakfast or getting ready for work. Today, she wasn't even pretending to keep up appearances, probably assuming I hadn't noticed a thing. I went through the motions, making coffee, each step feeling more deliberate than usual. I kept glancing toward the stairs, half expecting her to come down any minute, her face showing that same easy smile she'd always given me. But I was ready for it now. I'd watched hours of footage by then, each clip a nail in the coffin of our marriage. It had been like peeling back layers, revealing just how much they'd hidden and how carefully they'd planned it. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps, slow and measured, like she was trying to gauge my mood. I kept my back to her, pouring my coffee, steady and calm. She finally walked into the kitchen, her face blank, the slightest hint of caution in her eyes. "Morning, Jack," she said, her voice light, a little too casual. I could feel her watching me, like she was trying to read if anything was wrong. "Morning," I replied, not turning around. My voice sounded steady, almost too steady. She paused, waiting for me to say something more, maybe even an invitation to break into our usual chatter. But I kept my gaze on the mug in my hands, keeping everything in check. She didn't need to know what I'd seen yet. Not until I was ready to let her know. She poured herself a cup, moving around me like nothing had changed. "Busy night?" she asked, her tone a little too light, as if she'd rehearsed the question. Maybe she was trying to gauge if I'd gone down to the basement, or if I'd picked up on anything unusual. "Yeah." "Long shift," I replied, keeping it brief. I didn't trust myself to say much more. Just looking at her, pretending that everything was normal, took every bit of control I had. She sipped her coffee, nodding, that casual smile creeping back onto her face. "I've got a meeting with the school board later," she said, slipping into her usual routine, rattling off her plans as if the world hadn't just shifted beneath our feet. But this time, I was listening with different ears, hearing the lies that laced through every casual word. "Sounds good," I said, keeping my tone even. Inside, though, I was calculating, planning the next steps. I'd already gathered so much, but there was more I needed to confirm, more details to piece together. She lingered for a moment, hesitating, as if sensing a tension in the air, but too arrogant or too confident in her own game to address it. Finally, she left, her heels clicking down the hallway, leaving me alone in the kitchen with my thoughts and the evidence I'd built up. As soon as I heard the front door close, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder where I'd saved the footage. I watched one of the clips, a quick replay of last night, just enough to solidify my resolve. This wasn't going to end here. I wasn't just going to sit back and pretend everything was fine. I took a deep breath, staring down at my coffee, feeling that cold, clear focus settle over me again. I'd built my life around being steady, reliable, someone people could depend on in a crisis. And now, that was exactly the man I needed to be, for myself. Once she was gone, the house felt different. Empty, but in a way that felt freeing. The facade was gone, and without her here, I didn't have to keep pretending. I could finally let down my guard, even if it was just for a minute. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the folder of saved footage on my phone, feeling a mix of rage and resolve. After a few minutes, I got up and headed into our home office. I flipped through the stack of bills and bank statements piled up on the desk, remembering how we used to sit here together, balancing our budget, planning vacations, and mapping out our future. Now I was combing through it all for proof, clues buried right under my nose. Every receipt, every transaction felt like it could hold a piece of the puzzle. There, near the back of a folder, was a credit card statement with hotel charges I didn't recognize. One charge was for a weekday afternoon, and the amount was way above what Celine would normally spend. She had never mentioned any trips, no conferences, nothing that would explain a hotel. My hand clenched around the paper as I stared at the amount, realizing this was just one more piece of her betrayal. Then, scrolling through old texts on my phone, I found something I'd nearly forgotten. Messages from Orion. He'd sent them over the past few months, little things about checking in on Celine while I was on call, updates about when he'd stopped by. He'd even joked once, "You're lucky to have someone like me to look after her." I'd laughed it off back then, thinking it was just him being his usual carefree self. Now it felt like a twisted kind of taunt, a reminder of just how well they'd covered their tracks while pretending to be considerate friends. I dropped the statement and sat back, breathing slow and deep. It was becoming clearer, the timeline piecing together in my head, a story they'd crafted behind my back. All this time, they'd been so sure I'd never find out, so confident that my work schedule and trust would blind me. They thought they'd planned it perfectly, but they'd made one mistake. They underestimated me. I reached out to a guy from the station who worked with security setups on the side. Told him I'd need extra cameras installed around the house. Discreetly. Small, hidden ones that wouldn't be noticed. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. It was one of the perks of being a firefighter. There was a network, a brotherhood. He'd be here by tomorrow, he promised. I hung up, a cold satisfaction settling over me. Let them think they had me fooled. I'd gather every last piece of evidence until there was no doubt, no excuse they could use to twist this on me. By the time I was done, the truth would be undeniable, and they'd have no place left to hide. The next day, I went through the motions at work, but my mind was miles away. Every call, every check-in with the guys, every piece of equipment I handled felt automatic. Inside, I was counting the minutes, going over the plan in my head, making sure I hadn't missed anything. By the time my shift was up, I could barely keep myself from racing home. When I got back, the security guy was already waiting. He was an old friend from the department, trustworthy and no nonsense, which was exactly what I needed. As soon as I let him in, he got straight to work, no questions, no awkward conversations. We'd set up a few hidden cameras in key spots around the house. The living room, the kitchen, and, of course, the basement. He even placed one near the front entrance, angled just right so I could see anyone who came in or out. "You'll get an alert on your phone whenever the cameras pick up movement," he said, testing the setup from my phone. "Footage goes straight to the cloud. No chance of losing it, no matter what happens." I nodded, watching the screen light up with a live feed of my front door. Just seeing those images, knowing I had eyes everywhere now, gave me a strange sense of control. For once, I wasn't in the dark. I could see everything, track every lie, every hidden moment they thought they'd get away with. Once he was done, I thanked him, and he gave me a firm pat on the back. "If you need anything else, you know where to reach me," he said, his voice steady, supportive. I nodded, grateful for the silent understanding between us. He didn't need to know the details. He could see that whatever was going on, I was serious about handling it. After he left, I checked the cameras from my phone, making sure each angle was set up perfectly. Celine was still at work, but knowing she'd be back soon, I took the chance to look around the basement again. This time, I paid closer attention to the small things I might have missed before. Marks on the coffee table, a faint stain on the couch I knew hadn't been there before. Each detail felt like another small betrayal, a confirmation of everything I'd been piecing together. I sat down on the edge of the couch, letting my mind wander back to the times I'd shared stories with Orion here, laughing about the crazy things we'd been through together, never once suspecting he'd use that trust to stab me in the back. It was like being haunted by a version of my life that felt real but had been a lie all along. Then I heard the front door click open. Celine was home. I moved upstairs and watched her as she came in, her face relaxed, like any other day. She called out a casual "hey," and I forced myself to keep calm, to play along just like I had the day before. But this time, I had eyes everywhere. Every step she took, every move she made, I was watching. She had no idea. I nodded at her greeting, keeping my voice neutral. "Hey, Celine. How was work?" She glanced at me, surprised by the question. "Busy as always," she replied, brushing it off like we'd had this exact conversation 100 times before. "Yeah, same here," I replied, careful to keep things light. But behind that casual tone, I was watching her every move, knowing I'd have it all saved on camera, everything she tried to hide, every lie she thought she could bury. The clock was ticking, and soon enough, I'd have all the proof I needed. For the next few days, I kept up the routine, pretending everything was normal. I'd go to work, come home, make small talk with Celine, and watch her every move. I'd check the camera footage every night, scrolling through each clip like a detective piecing together evidence for a case. She had no idea I was watching, and for the first time since this nightmare started, I felt like I had the upper hand. Each evening, Celine would go through her usual motions. Making dinner, grading papers, scrolling on her phone. She'd talk about work, share stories about her students, and act like everything was perfectly fine. But I was paying attention now, picking up on every little detail, every small hesitation. I noticed the way she'd leave her phone face down on the table, or how she'd get a little too quiet whenever I asked how her day was. Maybe she thought I was clueless, that I'd fallen back into the role of the unsuspecting husband. But in reality, I was more alert than ever. Then, finally, on a Friday afternoon, I caught something on the cameras that made my blood run cold. I'd been out at the station for a late shift, but as soon as I got home, I pulled out my phone to check the footage from that day. It was a habit by now, a routine. But this time, the camera at the front door showed me something new. Orion, walking up the driveway, checking over his shoulder before knocking on the door. I watched as Celine opened the door, smiling, and let him in like it was the most natural thing in the world. My hands tightened around the phone as I watched the video. They moved into the living room, Celine laughing at something he'd said, her hand brushing his arm as they sat down on the couch, the same couch where I'd sat with her countless times. My stomach twisted as I watched them, every smile and laugh digging deeper, confirming everything I'd feared. They were comfortable, casual, like this was just another day for them. They had no idea they were being recorded, that every second was being saved, backed up in a folder they couldn't touch. And as I watched, something cold and final settled over me. They talked, laughed, but it was the way they looked at each other that stung the most. She looked at him like he was her world, like I was just a placeholder. And Orion? He had this easy, smug look, like he knew he'd gotten away with it, like betraying his best friend was just another thrill. I turned off the footage, forcing myself to breathe, to focus. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't afford to lose control now. I had what I needed, proof, undeniable proof. There would be no excuses, no lies they could spin. It was all there, recorded, ready for me to expose. I took a moment to let it all sink in. The time for planning was over. This was it. I knew the time had come to finally end this charade. I had everything, proof, the setup, and an audience that would see the truth with their own eyes. Every time Celine had smiled at me these past few days, every time Orion had made small talk like we were still close friends, it had only fueled my determination to bring it all down in one undeniable moment. That night, I arrived a little late to the fundraiser. The room was packed with familiar faces, co-workers, friends, and even some family members. All people who trusted Celine and Orion, people they'd charmed with their dedication to helping the community. I spotted them immediately. They stood by the entrance, laughing with guests, Celine's hand resting lightly on Orion's arm. They looked comfortable, even happy, like they'd gotten away with everything. As I walked up, Celine noticed me, her eyes widening in surprise. "Jack, you're here. I wasn't sure you'd make it," she said, her voice just a little too high, almost nervous. "Of course," I replied with a slight nod. "Wouldn't want to miss it. Big night, right?" She gave a tight smile, her hand drifting from Orion's arm. "Yes, really big," she said, glancing at him for reassurance. Orion gave me his usual easy grin, not an ounce of guilt showing. If he was even a little uncomfortable, he hid it well, probably thinking I was still oblivious. We exchanged a few words, and I let them carry the conversation, their voices eager as they talked about their work and their commitment to the community. Every word felt like a bitter joke, but I kept my face steady, knowing it was only a matter of minutes before they'd see just how well I'd prepared. As people settled in, I moved to the projector, pretending to be setting it up for their presentation. Celine and Orion were still smiling, glancing around at the crowd, unaware of what was coming. I opened my phone and connected it to the projector, pulling up the video folder. One tap, and it all began to play on the big screen behind me. At first, the room was filled with quiet confusion as people tried to understand what they were seeing. The video showed Celine opening the front door of our house to Orion, the casual touches, the laughter, the way they settled onto the couch together, completely at ease. The room fell silent as the reality sank in, as they recognized the people on screen. I turned, watching Celine and Orion's reactions. Celine's face went white, her expression a mix of horror and disbelief, her mouth slightly open like she was struggling to breathe. Orion looked frozen, his confidence shattered as he realized the entire room was watching their betrayal play out in real time. The footage spoke for itself. I didn't need to say a single word. For a moment, the room was dead silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The footage kept playing, each second unraveling the story of their betrayal right there in front of everyone they knew. I could hear quiet gasps, soft whispers, people shifting uncomfortably as they realized what they were watching wasn't some innocent home video. Celine looked around, her face frozen in shock, like she was struggling to make sense of it. I could see her mind racing, her mouth opening and closing, searching for something, anything to explain it away. But what could she say? Every second of that video was like a nail in the coffin, proof she couldn't deny. Orion looked like a man who'd been caught in a trap he never saw coming. He turned to me, his face shifting from surprise to anger, as though he couldn't believe I'd have the nerve to expose him like this. He took a step forward, looking like he might say something, but I gave him a hard look, a warning that told him not to try it. Finally, someone in the crowd broke the silence, muttering, "Oh my God," and it was like a dam burst. More whispers rose, people shifting and murmuring, glancing between Celine, Orion, and me, putting together the pieces. A few colleagues from the station looked at me with a mix of pity and shock, and others watched Celine, waiting to see if she'd attempt to justify herself. Celine took a shaky breath and finally managed to stammer, "Jack, this isn't what it looks like." Her voice was barely a whisper, her words crumbling under the weight of the truth. She looked lost, desperate to find some way out, but there wasn't one. The proof was right there, and everyone in that room had seen it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just looked her dead in the eyes and said, "It's exactly what it looks like." Those words hung in the air, heavy and final, cutting through any excuse she might have tried to give. Orion tried to step in, his face red, clearly struggling to keep his anger in check. "Look, Jack," he started, his tone defensive, but I cut him off with a look that shut him down instantly. I wasn't here for explanations or apologies. Not now. This was about letting them face the consequences of what they'd done, about showing them they couldn't hide anymore. The tension in the room was thick, everyone watching, waiting to see what would happen next. As the whispers spread through the room, Celine's face crumbled. I could see panic flaring in her eyes as she looked around, realizing just how many people were watching her. She tried to steady herself, tried to muster up some explanation, but the words wouldn't come. She knew, just like everyone else in the room, that there was no talking her way out of this. "Jack, please," she managed, her voice a pleading whisper. Can we go somewhere private? Please, let me explain." Her hand reached out toward me, shaking, but I took a step back, folding my arms, a wall between us. I wasn't interested in hearing whatever excuse she was scrambling to find. She'd had plenty of chances to be honest. She chose lies instead. "You already explained enough, Celine," I replied, my voice calm but firm. Everything I needed to know was right there. I nodded toward the screen, where the final clip had just ended. The room was completely silent, all eyes shifting back and forth between us. Some guests exchanged uneasy looks, probably wondering if they should leave, but none of them moved. Orion's face twisted with frustration. He glared at me, then at Celine, as if blaming her for the situation. The smugness he'd worn for months was gone, replaced by a kind of raw fury I hadn't seen in him before. "This is ridiculous, Jack," he said, his voice low, barely controlled. "You don't have to do this here." I tilted my head, my gaze steady on him. "I think it's exactly where this belongs, Orion," I said, not bothering to keep my voice down. "You two didn't care about keeping this quiet. You did it in my own home, so why hide it now?" A few people gasped softly, others muttering to each other, piecing it all together. Celine's face turned red, her eyes darting around the room, realizing how public her betrayal had become. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out, just a small, desperate breath as she struggled to hold it together. Seeing her like that should have hurt. And maybe it would, later, when I'd finally had time to process everything. But right now, all I felt was relief. Relief that I'd brought their lies into the open, that everyone knew the truth, and that there was no way they could twist it back around. I looked between Celine and Orion one last time, letting the weight of silence fall on them. They'd have to answer to everyone now, not just me. Celine looked like she was on the verge of tears, her face pale and her hands trembling. She took a shaky breath, her eyes searching mine, pleading silently for some kind of mercy, some chance to pull this all back. But there was nothing left to say, nothing that could undo what she'd done. She finally looked down, her shoulders slumping in defeat, her perfect image shattered. Orion, though, he still held onto a shred of defiance. He glared at me, a bitter sneer crossing his face as he realized there was no way out. "You're making a scene over nothing, Jack," he hissed, trying to keep his voice low, his tone full of resentment. "You don't need to destroy everything over a mistake." "A mistake?" I repeated, feeling a cold, hard edge creep into my voice. "You mean the months of lies, the time you both spent betraying me in my own home, right under my nose? That's not a mistake, Orion. That's a choice." He clenched his jaw, but he didn't respond, his gaze dropping as he realized he couldn't talk his way out. The silence between us hung thick and heavy, the weight of the truth settling over him, stripping away whatever pride he'd tried to cling to. I could feel the eyes of everyone around us, the shock, the pity, the judgment, all of it directed at them. People who had known Celine and Orion for years, who had trusted them, now looked at them with something close to disgust. Celine glanced at the crowd, her face a mix of shame and regret as she realized just how many people she'd let down. I could see it in her expression, the fear of losing the life she'd so carefully constructed. "Jack, please," she whispered again, her voice desperate. "We can talk about this. Just us. We don't have to do this in front of everyone." I held up a hand, stopping her words cold. "I tried talking, Celine. I trusted you. And you threw that trust away for him." I didn't bother hiding the hurt in my voice, letting her hear exactly what she'd done to me. "I don't need to hear any more explanations. You two made your choices. Now you can deal with the fallout." The tension in the room was thick, but I didn't care anymore. I took a step back, ready to turn and leave, but not before taking one last look at both of them. At Celine, standing there broken and ashamed, and at Orion, his face dark with anger, his world crumbling around him. They'd thought they could keep me in the dark, that I'd never find out. But now, everyone saw them for who they really were. Without another word, I turned and walked out, leaving them to face the mess they'd created. As I walked away, the weight of it all hit me, a strange mix of relief and sadness. I'd spent years with Celine, building a life that felt solid, grounded. Now, in a matter of days, it had all crumbled. But I wasn't turning back. This chapter was over. I stepped outside into the cool night air, grateful for the quiet. The noise from the event faded behind me, leaving only the sounds of distant traffic and my own footsteps on the pavement. Each step felt like a release, like I was walking away from all the lies, the betrayal, and the pain they'd left in their wake. I found myself leaning against my truck, hands shoved into my pockets as I took a few deep breaths, grounding myself. For a while, I just stood there, staring at the sky, letting the calmness settle over me. It was a strange feeling, being outside of it all, free from the games they'd been playing. They'd have to answer for themselves now, to their friends, to their community, to each other. Eventually, a few people trickled out from the hall, their faces etched with shock and pity. A couple of my buddies from the station walked over, giving me nods of support. They didn't say much, and they didn't need to. One of them clapped me on the shoulder, a silent show of solidarity that said more than words ever could. "You need a lift?" one of them asked, his voice low, careful. I shook my head, managing a small, tired smile. "Nah, I'm good. Just needed some air." They nodded, understanding, and after a few moments, they headed to their own cars, giving me space. I appreciated that. How they knew to just be there without making a big deal of it. After a few more minutes, I climbed into my truck, feeling a strange lightness in my chest. It was painful, sure. Nothing about this was easy. But for the first time, I felt like I could breathe, like I was finally free from the weight of pretending, of holding it all together while they tore my life apart. With one last look at the hall behind me, I started the engine, taking a deep breath as I pulled away. The life I'd thought I had was gone, but in its place was a clean slate, a chance to rebuild on my own terms. And as I drove into the night, I felt a sense of peace. I didn't know what the future would look like, but I knew one thing. It would be mine, and I wouldn't let anyone else tear it down again. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the engine and the stretch of empty road giving me space to finally process everything. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white, as the weight of what had happened sank in fully. I'd done it. I'd confronted them, taken back control, laid everything bare for them and everyone else to see. But that victory, if you could call it that, felt hollow. As I pulled into the driveway, I sat in the truck for a few minutes, staring at the house, our house. It was strange, looking at it now, knowing what it represented. This was the home we'd built together, the place where I thought I'd spend my life, make memories, grow old. Now, it was just a structure, walls that had housed lies and betrayals I'd been blind to. I couldn't tell if I hated it or felt sorry for it. Finally, I stepped out, grabbing my bag from the passenger seat. The air was crisp, and for a second, I just stood there, breathing it in, steadying myself. Walking up to the front door, I almost expected to feel anger, but it was different. There was a strange calm, a sense of finality, like I was closing the door on this part of my life, even as I opened it. Inside, the house was dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that felt empty rather than peaceful. I flicked on a light, setting my bag down and looking around. The photos on the walls caught my eye. Pictures from our wedding, vacations, family gatherings. They'd once been snapshots of a life I thought was real. Now, each one felt like a hollow reminder of the lies Celine and I had been living. I walked over to the nearest frame and picked it up, studying our smiles, the way we'd looked at each other back then. I felt a pang of something. Maybe grief, maybe regret, but I forced myself to set it down. The past was done. This house, these memories, they didn't define me anymore. I went through each room slowly, methodically, picking up little things, pieces of our life together that I knew I'd eventually pack up, put away, leave behind. As I moved, I started to feel lighter, as if each item I put down was lifting a weight off my shoulders. This wasn't just a house, and it wasn't my life anymore. It was a place I'd outgrown, something I'd shed, and I could already feel the first hints of freedom creeping in. I made my way to the bedroom, the place I'd slept beside her for years, thinking I knew her, trusting her. And yet, strangely, I didn't feel anger, didn't feel the betrayal clawing at me here. I felt ready. Ready to let this all go, to move on and find something real. After a while, I lay down, feeling the exhaustion finally take hold. The weight of the night settled, but it wasn't as heavy as I'd expected. Instead, there was a small, growing sense of peace, a reminder that, from here on out, the life I built would be on my own terms. The morning light crept in slowly, filling the bedroom with a soft, muted glow. For a few seconds, I lay there, letting myself wake up slowly, taking in the quiet. It was different. This silence didn't feel empty or cold. It felt like a clean start. I got up, glancing around the room that had held so many memories, so many dreams I'd once shared with Celine. But today, the memories felt lighter, like they were finally starting to lose their hold. I grabbed a few boxes from the garage and began packing, taking my time. Some things went in without a second thought. Her books, clothes, things that were part of her life more than mine. But other things, like framed photos and keepsakes we collected together, I paused over. Some of them I put away carefully, unsure of what I'd feel about them later. Piece by piece, the house started to shift, like it was slowly becoming mine again, reshaped by the things I chose to keep and the things I chose to let go of. As I packed, I thought about what life would look like now, the empty spaces I'd have to fill, the routines I'd have to rebuild. It felt strange, but a good kind of strange. The beginning of something unknown, something that was mine alone to create. Around noon, my phone buzzed. A few messages had come in from friends who'd been at the fundraiser, people reaching out to check in, see how I was holding up. I read through their words of support, the quiet strength that came from people who'd had my back long before any of this happened. I realized I'd still have plenty of support as I moved forward, that I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. After a while, I stepped outside, taking a long look at the neighborhood, at the life I'd built here. It wasn't the life I'd planned, not anymore, but that didn't mean it couldn't be something good. Maybe this was a second chance, a chance to rebuild, to find something better, something real. With a deep breath, I took my first step forward, leaving the house behind me, feeling lighter with every step. The life I'd known was over, but what lay ahead was unwritten, and for the first time, that felt like a gift. I could finally see the possibilities beyond the pain, beyond the betrayal. And as I walked down the street, I knew I was ready to start again.